Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Marissa Waterman. I'm the Marketing Director here at the Academy. Here with us today, we have Dr. Noemi Vergopolen, a professor at Princeton University in the Atmospheric and Ocean Science program. Today, Dr. Vergopolen will be discussing locally relevant soil moisture monitoring for water resources applications. Also joining us today is our interim executive director, Dr. Daniel Oether. Dr. Oether will serve as a moderator today. During the presentation, you'll be able to submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. Before we get started, Dr. Oether would like to say a few words. Dr. Oether, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, Marissa. I'm actually here in the classroom with a bunch of students that are actually watching this via Zoom, as well as some that are in their homes or their apartments as well. We thought it'd be interesting to have more students engaged in this, so we've invited them here today. I'd like to begin by saying welcome to today's webinar from the American Academy of Environmental Engineers and Scientists. As a reminder to everybody, Academy webinars are free to members of the Academy, and as an invitation, students are allowed to join the Academy for free. So these webinars are essentially free to students who have signed up for membership. The cost of webinars is actually covered through a contribution by sponsors. And if you'd like to sponsor webinars in the future, either as an individual or as an organization, please let Marissa know, and she'll be happy to well, of course, happy to take your funding, but more importantly, happy to get you plugged in with what our webinar schedule is and how you can contribute in ways to selecting webinar speakers and participating in sponsoring individual programs. Today we have Dr. Noemi Vergopolen will speak with us, and I've characterized, after reading through her materials, as bridging this gap, right, in between what we see as infrequent and coarse, but very good kind of satellite data of water resources, and then some of the ground truth stuff that we might see, like, you know, those little local rain gauges, right? So somewhere in between these scales is this gap. And we need this information. And so I'm really excited to see this presentation, to learn more about what scientific discoveries are available to be able to bridge this gap to understand water resources. In terms of a format today, we're going to listen to this presentation by Noemi, and I will encourage you, as Marissa said, to share your questions online. At the end of this webinar, we'll have a moderated Q&A. I'll have some discussion. But what's going to be then an addition is that we're going to have an after party, as it were. So once we stop recording, if you really want to engage with the speaker, she's happy to stick around for a while. So just like in a large conference hall where people would kind of come up and congregate around the speaker at the end and be able to ask some questions, we'll stop the recording, we'll elevate those in the audience to be able to be part of the panel, and you can discuss with Noemi your detailed questions. So if you got your cup of coffee at the end, or if it was in the evening and you brought your favorite cocktail, we're adding that component. And Noemi, we really appreciate you being willing to stick around at the end. So in terms of an introduction, Dr. Vergopolen is a computational hydrologist. She completed her baccalaureate studies in Brazil. She worked for a couple of years, and then she moved to Princeton University, where she completed both her master's and her PhD. She worked with professors Eric Wood and Justin Sheffield. Currently, she is working on an appointment at Princeton University, but also has an appointment associated with the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA. So please join me in welcoming Noemi to this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was such a nice introduction. Bringing up the topic on how can we use in-situ observations, but also large-scale models and satellite observations to reconcile hydrological information at local scales. And this is what I'll be talking a little bit today. So when we think as water resources and how do we use water, and some of like the grand challenge in monitoring terrestrial water, some of the topics that come out very frequent in the news and also in our day-to-day lives is hydrological extremes, right? Floods and droughts, how do they impact our day-to-day lives? Economic productivity and so on. Water scarcity, such as we see in most of California right now. Food security over the US, but also across developing countries across the world. Ecosystems health, how do water shape biosystems and ecological dynamics across the earth, right? So one of the key variables that are tied and connect to all these terrestrial water grant challenge is soil moisture, right? So one of the questions we want to answer here today is how terrestrial water systems will be impacted by climate change. And to answer this question, we're gonna look into soil moisture as one of the key drivers of this variability. Why? Why soil moisture? Why do we care so much about it, right? Soil moisture, in fact, controls all the water, energy, and carbon fluxes that happens at the land surface. For instance, soil moisture provides initial conditions for weather and climate prediction, as we want to know how much water evaporates from the land to the atmosphere, right? So if we want to understand climate to the short-term or long-term scales, we need to understand the soil water dynamics. For instance, soil moisture is a key predictor and a key driver of droughts, but also floods on the other extreme of these events, as very wet soil moisture conditions provide like optimal antecedent conditions for flash floods, such as we just saw like recently on the flash floods that happen in Kentucky, right? Extreme wet soil moisture can also lead to landslides, right? When soil water is saturated, extreme rain that comes shortly after may lead to movement of soils, right, across slopes. Extreme dry soil moisture conditions can also provide propitious conditions for wildfires, right? Other classic application, like widely used, is for agriculture, that we're going to talk a little bit today as well, but also biogeochemical cycles, as too little soil moisture conditions or too wet soil moisture conditions may lead to different biogeochemistry processes happening over the land, which may enhance greenhouse gases released to the atmosphere. So that's something we also want to think about. Soil moisture also controls the spatial distribution of soil organisms, for instance, plant and species, macro scale amphibians, right? As for instance, frogs that use soil moisture they need soil wet conditions as their habitats, but also proliferation of epidemic disease, such as Aedes vexin, and some specific type of mosquitoes that rely on soil wet conditions to reproduce, right? So if you want to track and monitor epidemics, understanding soil moisture spatial distribution is really important. And like more recently, as some of you may have seen in the news, soil moisture conditions can also be important for military defense, as we want to understand moisture. But some of the great challenge that we have when using soil moisture is that many processes that behave non-linearly at the local scales. So, for instance, we can think of evapotranspiration and crop productivity, right? As it knows, like it's like well known in the literature that plant growth and plant CO2 uptake follows what's called Boudicca curve. So plants are limited by either energy intake or water intake through the soil. This behavior is not linear, it's highly non-linear. So which means that more or less soil moisture conditions does not necessarily means that it will yield more or less plant growth, for instance. Another classic example is, for instance, in biogeochemistry, nitrification, where very low soil moisture conditions will inhibit plant absorption of fertilizers, and on the other hand, too wet soil moisture conditions may lead to fertilizers being infiltrated underground and being released to water bodies, which may release NO2 and other greenhouse gases that can be even more powerful in warming the atmosphere than CO2. So there is a lot of processes that are linked to the soil moisture that are not very well understood, right? And we can go on the entire afternoon discussing how soil moisture linked to each of these different applications that we just talked early on, right? So the question comes, okay, soil moisture is important and we need that to understand and monitor many water resources applications, right? How can we measure and how can we predict soil moisture dynamics? So we're going to go through three main sources of information that we have available nowadays. First one are in situ soil moisture observations, right? So usually back in the days, when we wanted to measure soil moisture, what we would do, go to the field, collect a soil sample, right? Weight the soil sample at the scale, dry it, and compute based on the weight of the wet and the dry soil sample, how much water content was available in the soil, right? These are called the gravimetric measures, but they are laborious, demands a lot of field work, and are very costly to be deployed. Recently, they've been developed indirect in situ measurements, such as based on electrical resistance, such as this type of sensors illustrated here on the right. They are very good proxies. So as of right now, they have uncertainties, but they are considered some of the most accurate measurements of soil moisture at the point scale. They do require local calibration, right? Because they're based on the electric sensitivity of the soil properties, but they're very good to measure soil moisture locally. However, not as much as the gravimetric measures, but they are also costly to deploy, and therefore they're not widely available. Let's say in the United States, we have about 1,200 of them, which is some good number, but still not enough, and I'm gonna tell you shortly why. Another source of information for soil moisture is satellite observations. So for instance, NASA has the soil moisture active and passive mission that allows global scale monitor of soil moisture dynamics with 2 to 3 days to revisit time. So somewhat very good temporal frequency. However, the observations of soil moisture are very coarse using those sensors. They are 36 kilometers resolution, which means that every 36 kilometer, you're gonna get 1 point information. Now, if we think about applications in agriculture, landslides and flooding, that scale is very coarse to what we need. However, it's a global estimate, which will give us like a big picture of how soil moisture dynamics change at the larger scales. In specific, this satellite, it's MAP, call it, it doesn't measure soil moisture directly, it measures brightness temperature, and then uses the radiative transfer model that will convert this measure of brightness temperature into soil wetness, such that warmer brightness temperatures means drier soil conditions, cooler brightness temperatures means wetter soil conditions. So based on these relationships between soil temperature and the electrical properties of the soil, these satellite sensors can retrieve soil moisture at these larger scales. And then another source of information that we have nowadays are called Earth system models. And what are the Earth system models? They're our best representation of the complex Earth system through physical equations. So they're numerical models, right? They integrate all the components of the Earth system. So they simulate through equations the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, the land, and all the set of different processes that are involved within the Earth system. So it's pretty comprehensive. And as I said, it's likely our best representation of the entire system in terms of equations. So in specific, how can we use these Earth system models is that the land component of these models allow us to simulate soil water processes. We're going to go through details how that happens into these models, right? However, the best and state-of-the-art Earth system models that we have nowadays enable us to simulate soil water dynamic process at 10 kilometers resolution. It's a little bit better than satellite observations, but they're still very coarse if you want to use soil moisture information for local scale application, right? And they're still computationally expensive to deploy over larger domains in long time series. So now, as I said, one of the challenges in monitoring soil moisture is that it's highly variable in space and time, right? So if we consider a domain, let's say this illustrated here on the right, of 36 kilometers, a box size of 36 by 36 kilometers. If we look into the soil moisture distribution over this domain, we can see it's highly variable, right? As I said, in situ observations will be very representative in an accurate measurement at the local scale, but they certainly will not be representative of the entire spatial distribution of over the larger domain, right? Satellite observations, as I said, the some of the best metrics we have nowadays is this map at 36-kilometer resolution, which will mean that the satellite will only give us 1 point information that should be representative of the entire grid, which, as we just discussed, it might not be the ideal. Earth system models and land surface models can simulate these processes at a bit finer spatial resolution, but they're still lacking the spatial detail that we need if we wanted to capture the processes that actually happen at the, let's say, sub-kilometer scale, right? So if we want to be able to use the soil moisture information to access and predict impacts on, let's say, agriculture and terrestrial water resources, these are the spatial scales that we should be thinking and modeling on, right? So as we can see here today, there is a unresolved spatial scale mismatch between the sources of information that we have in observation models and the processes that we want to solve, right? So to address this challenge, there's a need for integrated approach that will enable us to reconcile these different scales of observations, right? Such that we can use soil moisture hydrological information for access impacts on the Earth system and improving terrestrial water dynamics. So today we live in a very advantageous time where we have timely opportunities that will help address this challenge. Some of them is the advance of big data and satellite Earth observation. Nowadays, we have a vast number of big environmental data sets that we didn't have available, let's say 5 or 10 years ago, that now enable us to answer some of these questions regarding some soil moisture dynamic at unprecedented spatial scale. So for instance, we have a long time records of Landsat and Sentinel satellite observations, data sets that map soil properties across the US, for instance, at 30 meters and across the world, such as soil grids at 250 meter resolution, land cover data sets that are also derived from high resolution satellite observations, topographic and meteorology data sets, right? So these novel data sets that have been launched in the previous years now enable us to start to address these questions at a higher spatial resolution. But we also have advances in statistics and machine learning methods that will help us to harness information from these big environmental data sets. Advances in high performance computing in numeric systems, but also improving representation of physical processes within these Earth system models that we're going to talk a little bit more here today. So how can we leverage these unique opportunities that we have today to better understand and predict soil moisture? So the objective of this talk today was to demonstrate how can we use big environmental data, machine learning, and high performance computing to enable locally relevant hydrological information. So to this end, I'm going to introduce to you a modeling framework that I developed during my PhD, that I helped develop during my PhD, which is called hydroblocks. And how can we use this framework to advance realism in Earth system models by using these big environmental data sets? The second one, how can we unlock the potential of satellite Earth observation via land data assimilation, or as people often call in the machine learning language, data fusion, right? And how can we use this improved information that we have on the soil moisture dynamics to improve our understanding of how we as humans impacted the landscape and how this impacts the large scale Earth system predictability, right? So let's get started. The first component that we can talk about, coming a little bit back to the introduction, is the land surface models, right? How can we use land surface models to understand soil water dynamics, right? So for instance, a land surface model is breaking into 3 components, let's call mainly. The energy component, where you simulate how much energy does the Earth absorbs from the atmosphere, how does the plants interact with this energy, how this energy gets converted into sensible and latent heat fluxes and warms the ground and so on. The water component, so which is pretty much the hydrology component, which is the primary focus of my research. So how does precipitation infiltrates to the soil, at which rates, how much of the precipitation gets converted into runoff, how much plants absorb from this water storage in the ground layers and evapotranspire to the atmosphere, and also the carbon cycles, right? How do the plants uptake CO2 to the atmosphere, how those leaves fall into the ground, and how does the decomposition happens and emissions of different nutrients in gases to the atmosphere, right? So there are many different components in the land part of their system models. We're going to be talking in specific on the water component, which is focused on the soil water dynamics. So if we want to simulate soil water dynamics into our system model, we will pretty much resolving the Richards equation, which is a classic equation in hydrology, that controls and tells us how soil moisture here represented as theta changes over time. And that's a function of hydraulic conductivity, so it's a property of the soil, but also the elevation, topography, right? And soil water potentials, but also including sinks and sources, such as, for instance, precipitation as an input, as a source, and evapotranspiration, removing water from the soil as a sink. So we can use these models to solve for soil water dynamics in space and time using these simulations, right? Now, these models, these Earth system models, they roughly come in two flavors. It's what we call the fully distributed models and the lumped models, right? So what are their differences? The fully distributed models aim to simulate how does the climate interacts with the landscape at each single grid cell. So think about that. You split your domain into grids, right? And you simulate every single grid as a computing unit. And as a response, their distributed model, you have a distributed response of the climate. So you get rain at each grid, it simulates soil moisture dynamics at each grid. On the other hand, on the lumped models, for simplicity, they say, oh, we don't really care for how precipitation is distributed. We're just going to assume homogeneous load. So the entire system is simulated as a single grid cell, right? It's called a lumped model. And as a response, to these lumped models, we're going to yield a lumped hydrological response. So while in distributed models, you're going to get more details, lumped models, we're going to have a lumped response, right? So there are pros and cons in both of these approaches. Fully distributed models will enable us to represent the Earth system in a more realistic manner, but they are highly computationally expensive. And let's say if we wanted to simulate the entire soil moisture dynamics across the US at 30 meters resolution using the supporting data sets that we just talked about, some may even say that that's an infeasible task to be accomplished, given the high computational cost of the simulations, right? If you want to use lumped models, they are oversimplistic, right? Because they are not taking into account for the spatial variability into the processes, but they are computationally cheap, right? So how can we develop methods and tools that allow us something, let's say, in between distributed models and lumped models, and try to get a little bit of best of both worlds in terms of simulating soil water dynamics with these models, right? So the answer to this is what the hydrological community has developed, and they call it semi-distributed models. So let's go into what are semi-distributed models and how they work. So one of the ways to do them is to rely on the concept of hydrological similarity. And what this concept says is that locations with similar landscape and climate characteristics will yield a similar hydrological response. This is not a novel concept, it was developed back in the 70s. But the idea behind is that we can use high resolution data sets that characterizes the landscape, such as, for instance, elevation, slope, porosity, soil porosity, NEDVI, vegetation greenness, right? And cluster these 30-meter resolution data sets into areas of similar hydrological similarity, right? So for instance, if we cluster all these fine scale data sets into 3 clusters, we will be able to represent, let's say, this given catchment within 3 hydrological response units. In here, each cluster would represent a hydrological response unit. So in this way, we can simulate, and we can represent the entire domain, let's say with 1 million grid cells with only 3 hydrological response units, 3 computing units. So that's a massive reduction of the system in terms of computational expense required to simulate these processes, right? So Let's say, of course, this is a simple example, just illustrative. In reality, we don't partition the domain in only three clusters. We usually use 100 to 500 clusters, but that's already a massive order of magnitude in terms of computational requirements to simulate this basin, right? So what we did to develop hydroblocks was then to consolidate this modeling framework into an approach that enables to define the computational mesh of Earth system models, right? So we abstract this clustering framework into tiles. So if we can represent a given catchment into different tiles, that enable us to be able to simulate the interactions between each of these tiles in a modeling grid, right? So what we did next was to take this modeling framework and couple it, right, to a physical model, to a land surface model that enables to simulate the energy, the water, and the carbon processes that we just talked earlier today, right? So this enables to physically resolve soil water dynamics, right? Not at the grid space in a fully distributed model, but at the edge area, right? Or what some may say on the cluster space, right? So in this way, Hydroblocks modeling framework allows us to define the model computational mesh in a semi-distributed way. Here we use NoAMP land surface model to resolve for the soil water core physics. By using this clustering approach based on high resolution environmental data sets, we enable to achieve an effective 30-meter spatial resolution in the model computational mesh, which is enables to run the model in an efficiently way, but also store data sets in an efficient way. And this approach is scalable from local to global scales, and we're going to show some results of this scalability here today as well. So let's illustrate what all these simulations mean, right? So let's show an example for the US. We harness a lot of big environmental data sets at 30 meters resolution across the US. And we apply this Hydroblocks modeling framework to identify hydrological response units across the entire US, right? And we're going to use this coupled with NoAMP to then simulate the soil water dynamics across the entire country. So in specific, this experiment then is going to simulate 7.7 million square kilometers across the US. We're going to use 5 million hydrological response units instead of 8 billion 30 meters grid south. So we can see here a massive reduction of the dimension of the system in terms of computation expensive. We're going to simulate soil water dynamics at 3 hourly at an effective 30 meter spatial resolution between 2010 to 2019. This simulation was run in a HPC system utilizing 300 computing cores, run for about a week, right? Output of the simulations are 200 giga of a data set for one variable per year. So you can think of 1 year of soil moisture simulations across the US will yield 200 gigabytes at the edge area space. But if we're going to remap this to the 30 meters fully distributed simulation, this would yield 312 terabytes of storage. So you can talk about, we're talking here about massive data sets that it can become really unrealistic to work in a fully distributed model setting, right? So let me illustrate you here. This is a model playing. Let's see. There's a video which is supposed to be playing. Oh, here we go. So this is an example of one of the simulations of hydroblocks over the US, over the continental US. So as we can see, we can start to use these numerical model simulations to represent soil water dynamics across large domains. We can see that these simulations represent very well the imprint of rainfall events, such as when rain over a certain domain, you can see the soil getting wetter, so greener, and depending on soil characteristics at different locations, soil moisture is going to dry quicker or slower, depending on the soil hydrological properties. We can see the impact of big storms. You will see here from the southeast coast and moving all the way to the northern east, which will lead to wetter soil moisture conditions at the riparian zones, which create propitious conditions for flooding events and so on. We also see the extreme dry dynamics on most of the West, where even when you have rain events, the soil water infiltrates and evaporates back to the atmosphere very fastly. So with a like very quick soil moisture response. And we can also look at the simulations at the at a higher resolution at a specific location. So for instance, we have here a snapshot of the simulation over the Mississippi River basin. We can see that using these simulations at this hyper resolution scale, we can capture very well the soil water dynamics interactions at the riparian zones. We can see the imprint of the sand dunes in the meandric rivers that developed, the impact of reservoirs constraining, for instance, here on the right, reservoirs constraining soil water dynamics downstream, right? The impacts of urban expansion and urban settlements, changing also soil water dynamics and infiltration rates due to impervious surfaces, right? And also, if some are more attention, we can see some hotspots of soil, of very wet soil conditions here on these squares, which are in fact rice-paddied irrigation fields that can also be captured using these high-resolution data sets and modeling tools. So there's a lot of opportunities for using these tools and these methods to better understand the water use and water resources management, but now at the local scales. Now, if we look, let's say, look at this other site, which is near the Bay Area in California. We're comparing here a satellite visual image of this domain with hydroblocks model simulation. As we can see, we can capture very well the delta, right? All these flooded irrigation domains, they imprint at the urban areas, they imprint here on the landscape, right? Changing in aspect, changing soil moisture dynamics in there. We can see irrigation pipelines, right? That brings water all the way from the bay to Sacramento and so on, in the irrigation fields in here. However, some of the things the model cannot do yet very well, as if we look in this part here, is the irrigated fields, right? Well, let's look in this part here and in here. Soil water dynamics should be wetter in this location, and the model does not capture that. And why is that? Because numerical models, such as Earth system models, they were designed, and like that's by nature they're designed, to simulate soil water dynamics as in a pristine environment. But we as humans, we impact the environment. We use irrigation systems, we create reservoirs and dams, right, to sustain economic growth. However, there is a need still for these models to be further developed to better enable simulation of these processes as well. So we as a hydrological and land surface model community are moving towards now further including representation of these human water systems into these numerical models. Of course, it's a big challenge, but that's something that we as the community are working on. So now let's say we have the model capabilities to simulate soil water dynamics, right? Now, how can we take advantage of other resources such as satellite and in-situ observations to improve soil moisture monitoring at these local scales, right? One pathway to that is data simulation, right? So one of the tools that I developed during my PhD was an approach that's called SMAP hydroblocks, which relies on using this 30 meters soil moisture simulation, along with surface simulations of surface temperature and 30 meters soil properties that the model can simulate, and combine these model simulations with satellite observations of brightness temperature, right? So in specific, we're gonna use the satellite estimated ancillary data sets, such as vegetation optical depth, roughness length, and albedo, and the satellite actually observed brightness temperature, as I introduced it earlier on. The idea is that we can couple a radiative transfer model to hydroblocks, and then enable us to simulate what would be, given the 30 meter soil moisture estimations that we have, what would be the 30 meters brightness temperature associated to this soil moisture. And then we can combine both the model estimated brightness temperature with the satellite observed brightness temperature, right? To do that, we use the cluster-based spatial Bayesian merging scheme. And this Bayesian merging scheme relies on taking looking to the distribution of observation in the distribution of model simulation and try to come up with the best estimate. However, to do that, there are many uncertainties in both the model estimates and the satellite observed brightness temperature because the estimates are very coarse. So to reconcile these uncertainties between these two different scales, what we do, we use machine learning. In specific, we train a fusion algorithm using in-situ observations to learn at which conditions the model will give me the best estimate of soil moisture and at which conditions the satellite will give me a best estimate. And in this way, develop a fusion algorithm that will enable to estimate the best possible that we can like numerically do brightness temperature estimate at 30 meters resolution. This estimate of brightness temperature get feedback into the backward version of this radiative transfer model, which enables now to compute what would be the best satellite-based 30-meter soil moisture information that we can have across the US. The beauty of this approach is that by using these clusters in hydrological response units in the model and not a fully distributed model, we are able to reduce the dimension of the system by 300 to 300 times. So modeling the soil moisture processes and performing the data assimilation at those scales enables the feasibility of this approach, right? And we have demonstrated that by developing SMAP hydroblocks, which is now the first 30-meter resolution satellite-based surface soil moisture data set developed for the United States. So this data set, as I'm showing an example here on this figure of some of these locations, we can see that there's a lot of variability that can be captured at different scales, right? So this data set comprises from 2015 to 2019. 2015 was the year that the satellite was launched, so we don't have data before then. And 2019 was the year that this data set was finished, but we are in the plan of expanding this to near real-time applications. It comprises a 30 meters effective spatial resolution with 2 to 3 days revisit time, which is also limited by the revisit time of the satellite observation. In its entire scope, when we map it to the every 30-meter grid cell, comprises of 122 terabytes of data. So we're talking here like a huge, massive data set. Some ongoing applications using this data set relies on understanding drought conditions and drought impacts at the local scales, computing crop water demands for agriculture, as well as using soil moisture data to understand the antecedent conditions for flooding, wildfires, and landslides. So there is also a group in Florida using this data set to understand distributions of pine species in different ecosystems based on the spatial distribution of this soil moisture data set. Some future research would like to expand this data set coverage to global, as well as to a more current date. We're going to be not using Bayesian merging simulation, but we're moving towards using a deep learning approach for simulating this data set, and also including the assimilation of thermal and infrared, as well as possibly SAR sensors, which will be also enable us to capture some more local scale details, such as irrigation and wildfires, that are not well captured by SMAP satellite because of its coarse large-scale footprint of this sensor. We have a web interactive web interface at this domain here, waterai.earth, where you can play with the data, you can see the data, zooming at different locations at your house, at your field, and tell me later on what you think about it. We have performed some validation of this data set using in-situ observations. First off, we performed a spatial validation, which comprises in calculating the spatial correlation, which means that every time step that we have satellite observations and in-situ observations, we compute the spatial correlation at each time step. And that gives us a time series like this, which means that our merged product, which is SMAP, here showed in green, outperforms both the model showed in red, without any assimilation, as well as both NASA's product, NASA's MAP-L3, which was the input SMAP observation for this assimilation, is MAP-L4, which is the current state-of-the-art data assimilation product that NASA has. So as we can see here, this novel data set that we developed sustained the highest spatial correlation over time consistently, which gives us a good insights that this novel data set that we produced are actually improving the spatial representativeness of soil moisture. If we look at the same analysis, but now at smaller locations using highly dense in-situ soil moisture networks, such as the New York Mesonet and the Oklahoma Mesonet, we can see the results are in agreement. There's a large improvement in spatial correlation of soil moisture as you move first to fine scale with models. So showing that a model simulation already performs better than satellite observations in terms of soil moisture spatial representativeness. But when you combine the value of models and the satellite observations, you can produce an even better response. And that's observed both in using the New York Mesonet, the Oklahoma Mesonet, and across CONUS, computing all the different sensors. We also have done this evaluation looking to the temporal representativeness. So now, instead of computing the statistics over space, we compute the statistics for every single point, every single in-situ observation available across the US. We can see that there is on the median 0.73 correlation, which means that the data set's representing very well, with 0.07 of root mean square error in the 0.52 kg score, which is the Klein-Gupta efficiency score, which is summarized here on the left, and comprises a mixture of temporal correlation, temporal bias ratio, and temporal variability ratio. Right, so we found good statistics when you compare these statistics against the SMAP observations that were used as an input data in the model simulations per itself. We can see some correlation differences and inverse difference. In blue, we show where does the merged soil moisture product showed better results. So we can see that in overall, the novel data set really improves the value of soil moisture estimates, both in space, but also in time, which is very exciting news. So now that we have this data set, we can start to answer some of the questions that have been like on the field of hydrology for so many years, and people haven't been able to address these questions because we didn't have the data back then to start to think about these problems, such as what is the soil moisture variability at the local scale, right? And how the spatial variability persists. Are we able to, if the soil moisture variability persists at coarser scales, maybe we're fine of using coarse scale model or coarse scale observations, right? But if this variability does not persist, there is a huge benefit in fostering some of these data simulation models to, improve observations. So to answer this question, we did an analysis which relies on understanding, quantifying, right? What is the soil moisture spatial variability and what drives it? So to this end, we perform a spatial scaling analysis. First, this comprises in selecting every 10 kilometers grid across the US and computing what is the soil moisture spatial standard deviation, right? To each grid. And what we found here is that places, as illustrated in red, show high variability, which means the soil moisture varies a lot at these locations. And this is observed at most of the lower Mississippi River Basin, most of the southeast of the US, in the southeast coast, across Florida, largely, and near the US Great Lakes, right? Near the US Great Lakes. And we do observe some variability also over the mountain regions on the west, and the Appalachian Mountains here as well, right? So there's some places there is a lot, other places not as much, as we can look at here, let's say the US Corn Belt, the variability is not as large, mainly because agricultural fields tend to be flat and well managed to minimize this variability, right? Whereas in more under-touched natural environments, this variability exhibits different behavior, right? Now, what we did next was to perform a principal component analysis, which is a statistical method that enables us to compare how does this spatial variability observed in soil moisture across the US, that's now represented here in this color dots, varies with the same modes or different than different hydrologic characteristics, physical and hydrological characteristics at each location. So what we see here in this analysis that, of course, what drives the soil moisture spatial variability, high variability is observed at locations where you have high precipitation intensity, right? And also presence of wetlands, which means that at this location, the soil water, the water table of the soil is very shallow, which means soil and water are constantly interacting to each other, leading to more variability in both in space and time of soil moisture, but not as much driven by elevation, as well as grassland and shrublands, right? And that's because most of the places where you have high elevation in high grasslands and shrublands across the US are also dry, right? So that's why we see little of this variability. Now the question is how this variability persists across the scale. To this end, we did the following. We perform a synthetic spatial scaling analysis, which I'm going to illustrate here on the figure on the right. We select 4 locations, right? And then we upscale the 30-meter soil moisture data to coarser scale. So 120 meters, 240 meters, 450, and 1 kilometer. And then we compute this sigma here, which is the spatial standard deviation, so a measure of variability, and how this variability changes as we go to a coarser scale to a finer scale. And as we can see here, some locations, such as location 1, you have a 21% loss in spatial variability, which means that all the soil moisture variability you capture at the fine scale is retained at the 1 kilometer coarse scale. But to other locations, such as location 7 here, as you move from 30 meters to 1 kilometer resolution data, there is a 73% loss of spatial variability information, meaning that all the fine scale imprint information captured at the 30 meter is missed or vanished at the 1 kilometer scale, right? Now, if we map this information loss across the entire US, we can see that there are many locations across the landscape where you can see up to 80% of loss in soil moisture information as you go from 30 meters to 1 kilometer resolution. This variability loss is larger at topographic gradients, such as here over the Appalachian Mountains, most of the mountains on the West Coast, and so on. One of the questions that emerge is that, what is the implications of this information loss, right? If we're starting to analyze and try to monitor water resources and soil water dynamics at the fine scale in compared to use coarse scale observations data sets, right? Particularly as we introduced early on, there are many processes that varies non-linearly with soil moisture variability at this scale. So how can we, if we want to improve simulation monitoring prediction of this process, we should better take into account the spatial variability of soil moisture, right? And to conclude here very briefly, I know that time is running, so I'm gonna go through these last slides very quickly. What we want to do now is to use the data sets and these methods to better understand what's the benefit of having local scale hydrology information for modeling the Earth system, right? We have done some research trying to address how can we better detect droughts by using soil moisture information at higher spatial resolution. And we have shown that there are significant losses, drought misses rate that can reach up to 70% when using coarse scale observations in comparison to fine scale observations. This is very critical when you think in the context of, for instance, the US drought monitor system and climate models that are using to assess droughts, right? And currently, what I'm doing at NOAA GFDL is to implement this hydroblocks modeling framework into the NOAA land surface model, and we're developing a soil moisture satellite data simulation now using a deep learning method called LSTMs. And the idea is that this modeling framework will be coupled to the NOAA Earth system model, which is called the more recent one, which is called SPEAR. And our developments are leading to such that we can, in the future, use the soil moisture information from satellites and in-situ observations to improve the forecast system in the US. And with that, I would like to conclude this talk and open for questions. I think I see many on the chat here on crossing this in situ and satellite observation. So I think it will be very nice if we can answer some of them.
Yeah, Noemi, thank you so much. It was fantastic presentation. So one of the things that we'll do here is a little bit of moderated kind of chat, you and I, to kind of wrap up at the end, and then turn it open for you to kind of free form. And so that's kind of the after party when we stop doing the recording. But one of the things that I saw from looking at kind of Q&A and looking at chat, and think one of the things that folks raised was the role of drones, right? You know, so there is a physical measurement system that is in between, right? Soil moisture and satellite. Can you speak to that a little bit, and how that fits into, because that didn't used to be there decades ago, but is certainly there now. So can you speak to drones?
Certainly. So I foresee the drones will be certainly a next step in the coming future. One of the challenges is that depends on the applications. Now, if we're thinking of using drones to monitor and understand the specific location, let's say you're a farmer, you have your fields, and you hire a geographer to map your soil moisture dynamics in your farmer. You can use drones, and you can already estimate, let's say, crop yield and soil water content using these drone estimates, right? One of the challenges with drones is scalability as of right now, right? So you might be able to have a very good soil moisture information in a specific location, but as of right now, we don't have drones that cover the entire US every 3 hours, right? Or every 2 to 3 days. So one of the challenges with drones right now is the scalability. I think that with the advance of self-flying drones, we should be able to start to monitor, if there is interest, large domains across the earth with drones. And that would certainly improve the resolution of the satellite estimates, which are very coarse. Perfect. Now, there are some attempts, which are not drones, but to use CubeSats, right? So they are cheaper satellite sensors, this size. They're launched over the atmosphere. They can also improve the resolution to capture soil moisture fine scale resolutions. But as of right now, they haven't been scaled yet, right? I didn't talk into the detail, but there is the difference between measurements of thermal and visible versus microwave, right? So I don't know if that was a question or not. But
that's a perfect question, right? We'll wait for Elon Musk to tweet about that, and then we'll all have the answer to those satellites. So I saw two other questions that I really wanted you to kind of address for the group. One was at a more science scale, and one was a more policy scale. You know, one of the things that's interesting at the science scale is what things can be measured, what things are inferred locally. You mentioned this with terms of irrigation and anthropogenic kind of impacts, vegetation choices. How about fires and the relationship between pyrocarbon and soil moisture? Can you speak to the science, particularly about that, as we're seeing more wildfires?
Right, definitely. So in terms of data and information, models can simulate fires, and models can simulate, like the carbon modules of the Earth system models can simulate carbon uptake and carbon release to and from the atmosphere, including due to fires, right? Satellite observations can also capture fires impacts. Like, you know, you see a very hot surface from satellite when a fire is happening and shortly after. So you can capture these processes, but you do need the thermal-based satellite observations, which they only see the surface. They don't really see water content at the subsurface layers. So there is always a trade-off on how can we use these tools to measure and monitor wildfires. But I think there is very good progress being done in the scientific community as well right now to better use these data sets to understand what drives wildfires, what are the optimal conditions, such as, you know, dry soil moisture, high vegetation fuel load, as well as strong winds, such as we saw many of these events happening on the Colorado this
Perfect.
summer, right? So I
Yeah,
think
that's
there's a lot of opportunity
It's
to use
wonderful.
this method. Yeah.
The other one that I wanted to get a little comment from you on is at the high level, the policy. So of course, NOAA data, NASA data, satellite data. So the interface, right, with USGS and what they're trying to do, the Army Corps, what they try to do. But then thinking agencies like USDA, soil moisture and the relationship to crops, or USAID, soil moisture in the relationship to famine in other countries. If you could speak a little bit more on the policy side of that and what that's like working in this kind of science policy or interface to science policy space.
Right. I think there is a lot of work going on. Like, let's say for NASA, they have this map. They are launching a new satellite next year called NISAR. It's a global satellite with SAR sensors, a different sensor. There is a lot of interest in monitoring soil moisture. There's a lot of challenge as well. It's a very difficult variable to capture and understand this variability at the local scales. But in terms of monitoring, droughts and crop yields and famine, I think like as of right now, like let's say I'm doing the science that I'm doing might be like pushing the boundaries in terms of what's the best we can do in terms of application. I think many of the scientists and like practitioners working out there with these data sets, all they need is like, I need to know what is the just a information. Most of the applications and research done, let's say at the large scale or developing countries, they're only needing a point information. They don't care if it's high resolution or not, right? Because there is such a lack of availability of these data, of like these high accuracy data sets at the most of the developing countries. In terms of the US, there's been very good research on trying to harness some of these latest developments, but they have been mostly on field studies for specific proof of concept applications. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of policy to make such data sets more available and also easy for practitioners to use. As I mentioned, this is like 120 terabytes of data. I can't just come to a farmer in California and say, or even a water management in California, say like, here you go, process the data and make it this usable information for your community. I think there has been some progress, but there's also a need for a more concerted effort between all these agencies, USDA, NOAA, and NASA, to create also not just the science, but the supporting tools that will enable stakeholders and users access this data in an easy and friendly way and make decisions from there. So that's a lot of my interest to also improve how can people use this information.
Exactly. That's always right. We scientists will create lots of information, but we hope people can use it, right? So
exactly.
Well, Dr. Virgo-Polin, thank you for taking time out for a busy schedule. We're not done here. This is where we're going to do a little transition. We'll stop the recording. I will drop away in terms of my picture being big and visible from the moderated discussion. Marissa's going to come in and say a few words, and then we're going to transition to a little bit of after party. So this would be like at a normal seminar when you stay on and we elevate some of the people that have questions to panelists as well, so they can interact with you. So we really appreciate you taking time out to do this webinar today. Thanks for your support of environmental science and engineering. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Marissa, over to you.
Yep, and thank you everyone for all your questions. Thank you, Dr. Virgo-Polin, for sharing your knowledge with us today. If anyone would like to reach out directly, Dr. Virgo-Polin's email is noemi@princeton.edu.
I can put in the chat to that. So.
Sure, thank you. Also, we're trying something new today, like Dan said. We're going to stick around for a few more minutes to answer any additional questions you might have. We'll end our event, we'll stop the recording, and if you want to stay on and have the opportunity to ask more questions, you can. A few more items I wanted to mention before we get to the after party. We have several webinars planned in the near future, so you can go to aaes.org/events to check them out and register.
I have here.
And if you're interested in sponsoring an upcoming webinar, please reach out to me directly at mwaterman@aaes.org. Just a reminder, if you're not yet an AAES member and you're considering joining the Academy, please email me to discuss our membership options. And last but not least, the PDH certificates for this event will be sent out shortly. That's all for today. Again, if you'd like to stay for the after party, please do. Thank you so much and have a great day.